What would you do if your boss asked you to purchase some carbon offset credits now, today? You need to reduce your carbon footprint quickly, and no one has a clue where to start. My next guest has your back. Think of Airbnb. It's a thing. It's real. It's an API, but it's also a marketplace. Let's get to my next guest, the CEO and co-founder of Patch, Brennan Spellacy. I'm your host, Ernesto Glucksman. Thanks for checking the show out. Brennan, man, thank you for joining me on the show. I know you're super busy because you guys just got, well, we'll just start with the news part of it, right? You got some funding, you got some capitalization, a Series B. That must be really exciting. It's like, oh, now you can invest in scaling components and people and things, right? Before we dive into that bit of it, let's just jump into give me the 30-second. I just sat down. We're about to have drinks with dinner or something, and I just asked you hey, so what kind of work are you in?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ernesto, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So at the highest level, Patch is a software platform that enables corporates to interact with what are called environmental markets. Environmental markets are a fancy way of saying taking climate action. So really, we make it really easy for corporates, so primarily technology companies, Fortune 1000 companies, to take effective climate action at scale.
Perfect. I was like, oh, hey, Brennan, tell me more. That's what I would do if we were actually having dinner, which is what I'm going to do. But let me try to give my first impression of what it is that you guys do, and then correct me where I'm totally off. Okay. So
Sounds great.
think I look at your platform, I look at the availability of the APIs, but there's also this front end. I look at this sort of ability to connect this marketplace of providers of carbon offsetting services, right?
Yeah.
And you're in the middle between those guys that have a wind farm or have some kind of sequestering carbon, and you're in the middle of creating the connection between those guys and the companies that need to purchase carbon offsetting so that they can get to net zero or whatever target goals they have for their process and productions and things like that. Right?
Yeah, that's accurate. Yeah, at the highest level, Patch is a marketplace for climate action. So just like you said, we work with a really wide variety of what are called carbon credit developers. These are organizations that develop land in a way that abate or remove carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So whether that's something as familiar as reforestation, which is all about using photosynthesis to capture carbon, or something as human engineered or foreign as direct air capture, which are almost like these large fans, these industrial facilities that suck in air and then remove the carbon dioxide that's present within that air. So we work with a really wide variety of technology types. And then just like you said, we load that capacity into the platform and enable corporates and technology companies to take action wherever it makes sense for them. So that could look like using that visual interface we were describing before. We have what's called the Patch dashboard, which is just a web application. So you can actually go to patch.io, sign into your account and start taking climate action from there. But we also have what's called an API, which is how computers talk to each other. So if you're an organization like Afterpay, which is a Patch customer, and you want to embed climate action within, in this case, the Afterpay app, we actually give you a couple lines of code that you can write, that you can actually embed it within the actual experience. So they have enabled their millions of daily active users to take climate action from within the Afterpay application using the Patch API. So really the core of the platform is really how do you make it really easy to take climate action and also meet people where they are, right? So whether that's ahead of sustainability, whether it's ahead of product, where people want to take climate action is a little bit different depending on the goals and strategy of a particular organization. And we really want to mirror those needs, right? How do we make sure we're building a platform in a really flexible way to make sure that we're hitting the needs and desires of a really wide variety of companies? Because that's how we're going to truly achieve climate action at scale.
Man, okay. So there's probably 100 use cases for all this stuff. So let's just sort of dive into a hypothetical one, walking me through. let's say I have an e-commerce company. Let's say I'm somewhere in California where there's like the local state regulations are a lot stronger and I have to reduce my carbon footprint by a certain percentage. Let's say that's the scenario that I'm in. But I have a bunch of customers that purchase the whatever widgets that we make, and they purchase it through an e-commerce system. Can I leverage Patch? Can I insert this code in the transactions that my customers are making and get to a point where I'm like, hey, check mark this button if you want to purchase a little more above the purchase price of the widget that I bought. If I want to add a little bit more to offset the carbon that it took to like that it cost to make that. Are we there? Like, is that possible?
That's definitely possible. That's definitely one use case. I think, we won't get into the nitty gritty, but the devil is really in the details when it comes to software development. So it depends on what platform they're built on. At the highest level, if you have the ability to customize that platform, you could leverage Patch to do that type of customization. What we've actually seen with most e-commerce companies is typically we're not actually integrating with the retailer or the brand, but rather the platform those brands and retailers are built on top of, Afterpay being an example of that. And it's actually all about how do you encourage the right action. And instead of giving the user or the kind of end customer the ability to choose, which we have seen not on Patch, but we have seen that in the market. We've actually seen a lot more people who are using Patch make it automatic, regardless of whether or not the customer opts in or not. And the reason we've seen that shift actually comes down to the idea that brands and retailers, instead of saying we want to be perceived as sustainable, but only in the eyes or kind of only under the direction of a particular consumer, they want to say as an entire organization, this is what we stand for. So it's actually a much stronger statement to say, if you're shopping with me as a brand or organization, these are the values you subscribe to. And so we're going to actually have this be built into the cost of every good sold, non-negotiable.
Right. Okay.
So that's the kind of the model you've seen happen a little bit more often, but theoretically, both are a bit buildable within Patch.
But it is possible to sort of like outsource on the transaction level to your customers, in theory, as a possible solution. Yeah, or you could be like Patagonia and be like, no, we have to be totally like the whole company's bought in. So it's already baked in. And what probably the largest companies struggle with these days, from my understanding, is, well, where are these programs? Where are these carbon capture, carbon, where do I have to contract directly with each of them? Is there like a group of them already on your system that I can choose from? Because that would make things a lot easier.
That's exactly right. So you've actually called out a very critical pain point that we're solving, which is the solution to climate change, unfortunately, has no silver bullet. And as a result, we're going to actually need a really wide variety of solutions to scale over the next 2 decades to solve that. Whether it's in decarbonization, which looks like replacing fossil fuels with some sort of kind of greener alternative, or whether it's carbon removal, which is the role the Patch typically plays in, which is, again, we have all those different chemical pathways and ways you can sequester carbon dioxide. The point you're making, though, is sustainability leaders understand that you need this portfolio approach, but it's incredibly onerous to actually operationalize that for that exact reason. You have to have a different master service level agreement with every single organization you're working with. Sometimes there are minimum order quantities. At times, people simply just cannot find these organizations, or maybe they're not allowing for the purchase of fractional credits. So again, a carbon credit represents 1 metric ton of carbon. That's like a very large amount, especially in the context of e-commerce, right? And so how do you kind of move to a model where you have one entity you work with, in this case, Patch, and by association, or you're almost like through a transitive property, get contracts with, in this case, 50 plus different organizations and an order of magnitude more of different chemical pathways. And so that's kind of the model that Patch is working towards. How do you make it really easy to do the right thing?
Okay. Woo. Because the thing with the marketplace setup is you got to have both players in there at the same time, right? Because if you don't have enough projects that are sequestering carbon or whatever they're doing, free forestering things, but you have a bunch of people that want to like buy carbon offs, then you got a problem there. But the flip side is there too. You signed up a bunch of people, bunch of projects that can sell carbon, but you don't have enough buyers, right? So how do you manage that as you're sort of starting the platform? I mean, this is relatively new, but you've got a new Series B. You got real money coming in. It's a real platform. It's happening. How do you sort of manage that balancing act of reaching out to people, or do they find you, or what's the process like?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So what you're describing is called the cold start problem, which faces any marketplace, any digital marketplace. So Airbnb faces problem, Uber faces problem, and Patch faces problem as well. And really the key to kind of overcoming that is typically you actually have to fake one side of it in the first couple of months, right? And so in the case of Airbnb, they faked supply. So they were focused on acquiring buyers, and they went to Craigslist and listed listings that were on Craigslist on Airbnb. And then when someone would book on Airbnb, they would then book it on Craigslist on the behalf of
I see, on behalf
the behalf of the Airbnb customer, essentially. What Patch did was we actually faked supply, where we had a model where we knew all the different suppliers were out there, but none of them really wanted to spend time with us unless they were prepared to bring them sales. And so what we did was we said, hey, these are all the people we hypothetically work with. We went out,
I see,
got a few deals done. And when we saw those deals beginning to come to the finish line, we had finished drafting those supplier agreements. And so essentially, once we had those first kind of orders on the buy side locked in, we were able to onboard our first couple of suppliers really, really easily. We benefited from the fact that we're a B2B marketplace. So typically B2B sales motions take longer. And so it's actually much easier to like line up the exact timelines of a supplier contract and a buyer contract to make sure that they finish at the same moment versus like a consumer marketplace, like an Airbnb, where it's peer-to-peer. And so there's a lot of like rapid action happening. So it's actually a much more complicated exercise that thankfully we did not have to overcome.
I see. So you have to be you have to do the sales process more. You sort of list, this is the inventory we want to target, want to get involved. You start lining up the retailers on that side, interested in exploring the package, because they have the pain point of having to, we got to find, carbon offsetting programs, and then you move that process along a little bit, and then you're able to call these guys and they pick up the phone because now you actually have a lead for them to buy the carbon the carbon credit. Like, I don't even have the right terminology figured out. So who's the supply in your perspective? Who supplies?
The suppliers are what are called carbon credit developers. So these are the organizations that develop land to abate emissions or remove emissions in some way.
Okay. Of course, the other guys are supplying cash, right? So that's good too, right? The other
that is good.
Now, but both, it's interesting because not every state, unfortunately, we don't have until recently, we don't really have a big national push necessarily, except as of recent, but every state has different regulations. So did you focus on certain states? Did you focus a certain vertical when you sort of got this sort of seeding this project, the cold start problem?
No, so we really focus on industry instead, actually. So the world Patch operates in is actually what's called the voluntary carbon market, which means it's by definition voluntary. It's not compliant. So regulation is not completely decoupled, actually. We're beginning to see some regulators begin to lean into kind of making sure that there are some ground rules, if you will, in the voluntary carbon market. But for the most part, participation is not required today.
Right.
And so for us, it was really all about who has essentially relatively low footprints, but high profit margins. And that's actually the organizations we went after, because those were the ones who had the highest likelihood of having meaningful budget to compensate with. And then essentially the strategy is go after these folks first, and then have them drive down the per unit cost of these different forms of carbon removal projects, because they are so very expensive today, such that when the kind of lower kind of profit pool, higher emitter organizations kind of begin to effectively decarbonize, by the time they are ready to start compensating, that price per ton has come down significantly. So for us, it was all about focusing on who is mission aligned and actually has the capital that they can actually spend on this particular problem.
So probably like high-end retailers that have a big, that's part of their brand to be seen as doing, helping with the climate as well as providing the service, or that's sort of the realm you probably started with, right? Because they have the most probably wiggle room in cash and budget, and probably since it's attached to their brand, the more there's more compelling reason for them to explore this. And they were probably having a hard time finding the supply, right? The carbon developers, or getting to the point where like you want to diversify your carbon, you want to have a couple because some of those projects don't go well, or, who knows, whatever reasons. Because that's been the thing that I've noticed in this sort of world as we're starting to stand up these carbon offsetting credits, is that it's hard to measure like just how much carbon you really are offsetting, right? And I would assume that a startup company that's just focused on the software and the marketplace and just getting that going, you're not in the business of verifying, certifying. That's probably a bunch of other nonprofits that are involved in that space. But there is some aspect, right? Like you are picking reputable projects of carbon credit developers to bring into the platform. You have probably a list you're targeting, right? Can you tell me a little bit about that and like how far you can go now versus what you think you can do in the future in terms of verifying the projects along?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think to take a step back, the kind of core philosophy Patch has is we need to have hundreds of initiatives in parallel, right? We really need to be taking this yes and approach to climate action. And the reason for that is the unfortunate reality is that no climate solution, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's reforestation or prevented deforestation, whether it's direct air capture, whether it's hydrogen, nuclear, they all have their inherent limitations at specific scales and in specific geographies, right? In photosynthesis, you're limited by the rate that a tree can actually absorb carbon. Photosynthesis takes time and you're rate limited by that. In the case of wind and solar, you're rate limited by the actual attributes of where you're deploying that physical asset, right? So if it's not particularly windy or not particularly sunny, you need to complement with some sort of storage solution. And so all these things have limitations. Basically means you need all these things happening in parallel so that they can complement one another. That's kind of the core key element here. And so when you take that approach, that basically means the certification bodies you're alluding to, which is actually kind of a fairly vast and continuing to evolve ecosystem where there are these organizations that will actually audit the underlying carbon projects and say, hey, you have sequestered X, Y, Z tons of carbon per year, and therefore you get to sell this many credits. There's quite a few of them. And as a result, what Patch does is we actually integrate with those specific systems and pull that data into the platform. So essentially, in order to list on Patch, you need to have a reputable third party be able to verify and vouch for that environmental benefit you're claiming, whether it's a ton removed for 10 years, a ton removed for 10,000 years, whatever it might be, like whatever metadata you have a third party that can actually evaluate that with a high degree of certainty. And then only then can you actually list onto the Patch platform. And we surface that data, or we view our role as servicing that data and driving that transparency, because there is a lot of complexity, right? So how do you understand the difference between all the different certification bodies? How do you understand the idea of, well, what is durability? Durability is how long does that benefit last for? So is 100 years versus 1,000 years, is that kind of nuance important to your organization or not? So all of this information that's historically not been consumed by sustainability teams is now getting presented to them and standardized and allowing them to make more informed decisions on what they're actually buying.
Okay, awesome. I mean, to me, it's almost like I don't have a dog in this fight, a direct one, right? But man, it sure would be nice to actually see what are all the certifying bodies and the entities involved, the third-party entities involved in certifying these. It'd be awesome to go to one e-commerce, I don't know even what you call, but one platform where I could just go look at and then see as others are created and made. And the reason that's interesting to me is half my show, half the last several years has just been bringing folks from different trade associations, and they're all going through this like discussion of like, well, how do we certify? Like, how do we self-regulate if we can? How do we make it, a third party involved? And they're kind of like, there's a lot of activity just trying to like navigate that process of like, even how do we actually do the audits themselves, right? And there's going to be some groups that are better than others, some more precise than others, in all these specialties of technologies that are going to be that are being thought of and created and invested in right now. So at some point, some of that's going to settle into like these become gold standard ones versus these kind of like have their trade-offs that are not that great. Do you envision, I mean, it's probably early right now, but do you envision playing a role in sort of just at least surfacing that publicly from the platform and the work you guys are doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I think the key element here is transparency and understanding what is going on within the market. And so, like you're describing, this kind of these third parties, there actually are new ones coming on, and you actually can view them all within Patch and understand, well, who's been around a long time, who hasn't, who has a long operating history, who doesn't, what geographies do they operate within, what governing bodies do they affiliate with themselves, because there's actually a higher order of integrity councils that actually are going to be governing the certifications as well. So you think about governance and markets at scale, typically you need a lot of different parties involved. And so in carbon markets, that looks like the Integrity Council for voluntary carbon markets, where they're actually establishing what are called core carbon principles that'll influence all the different certifying organizations, right? So you essentially, they're coming up with what is the lowest common denominator, and then the certifier can take that information and build off of that. The other thing that's going to be really interesting is understanding how federal governments play here. So already we're beginning to see the SEC and the FTC specifically begin to show intent on wanting to regulate the voluntary carbon market. So here at Patch, we actually engage policymakers fairly often. The reason for that is actually less around wanting to influence policy one way or another, but actually just understanding what is the framework they're going to come up with and how can we use our software to amplify that framework. Because really that is the most effective thing software is truly good at. Software is not actually good at coming up with novel ideas, but once you have that particular novel idea or that framework, it's incredibly remarkable at scaling that idea. So that's going to be really what we're focused on, is how do you understand what are all the frameworks that are out there, who's saying what about who, and how do you proliferate that in a really easy to digest way, with the kind of core pillar being that transparency element. So that's really going to be where we play. And so if there are going to be organizations or certifications that are in conflict with one another, we'll surface that within the platform, or maybe they're incompatible. If there's ever a world where certifications are kind of getting sunset, that'll get surfaced in the platform, but Patch will never play an active role in kind of engaging or sunsetting a certification. It's going to be decided by the regulating bodies that we were just describing earlier. And then we'll make sure that all of the people using Patch are covered by using the software.
Right. So I would be, if I was using your software and I had that hooked into the API, it'd be nice where I wouldn't have to necessarily follow exactly the details, but I know that I could rely on Patch when there's a major change to one of those standards or standardization, right? Like the whole process of standardizing technology is like incredibly difficult and involves so many conversations and but that's the process that's happening now, right? So in the middle of all this, we also then get like criticisms of ESG. Is it really real? Is it real? Are they really measuring what needs to be measured? Then you have like these, like the finding the common denominator, like, okay, ExxonMobil has a high ESG rating. You wouldn't think, that you wouldn't expect that. But given the vertical and the way they evaluate, out of all of the oil extracting producing companies, they actually are the best in that, and that sort of becomes the gold standard. Like knowing that nuance, that's a lot of nuance to digest. And so when I just am a retailer or I'm a big business to business company, I don't have all that time to do it. It would be nice to just be able to jump on a platform, find something that looks pretty good. It looks like a lot of others are using it. Looks like there's a third party that's been validated. All right, let's just move forward with that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think the way Patch believes in doing that is really understanding what your climate strategy is and then making it really easy to execute on that. And so there are some situations where people will come to us and they won't have a carbon footprint and they won't know what their climate strategy is, right? When I say climate strategy, it's really about what's your glide path or kind of transition plan to a net zero future. Is that what you're actually going after? When are you trying to do that? Is it by 2030, 2040, 2050? Patch will not do that for you. What we actually do is we have a really long bench of partners, both tech-enabled as well as consultancies that will help you with that work. So what we'll actually do is we'll refer organizations to, hey, I don't even have a climate strategy. We'll refer you to one of Patch's partners. And then we know they'll come back once they're ready to execute and amplify that climate strategy. And that's really where Patch shines.
Then you're sort of, I mean, this sounds amazing scenario for you, for a company to be involved in, but I also start to freak out a little bit about like the amount of software maintenance observation. Like it's going to change, like your APIs are going to change, where you integrate with your partners are going to change. There's almost probably a constellation that you're constantly having to like check and monitor, and then maybe even spin off another team that just does integration work on something else. Like, what's that like right now? What's the scene you're in right now? And then maybe you can describe to me like what's the next level that you're going to get to now that you've got some extra funding to level up.
Yeah, absolutely. So feel free to interrupt me, by the way, if I'm getting too in the weeds. So I was the one who actually programmed the first version of the platform. So I have a tendency to start really high level and then quickly dive super deep. So feel free to reel me in.
Break my brain. I'll let you know. Let's go. Take me.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll do my best to. So I think you actually raised a really interesting point, which actually amplifies the importance of Patch, which is this idea of integrating with all these different systems, and they're giving you a variety of information. Right. That's where the standardization of the data comes from. Right. So the information one certification body or one carbon removal project gives you might be different. And what Patch basically does is we're integrating with all these systems and doing a huge amount of post-processing or basically manipulation of that data to present it in a standard way. If you are an integrator with Patch, if you are essentially on the buy side of the platform, you never have to worry about that problem. And the reason for that is Patch is going through the effort to come up with I believe Stripe coined this term, or an engineer Stripe coined this term, this idea of decade-long abstractions, which is think about all the potential corners of a particular problem, right? So if you think about an underlying carbon credit, underlying certification, what are the kind of 7, 10, 15 fields, pieces of data that are always going to be present, and what shape do they potentially take? And that's actually the exercise we go through before launching any new API at Patch. And what we've noticed is the endpoints or the abstractions that we've thought about long and hard enough typically don't have to get changed. The values that might be in them might be different, or there might be more data that shows up, but the data itself will never change format or change shape. The actual underlying data itself might just become richer. And so that's really the model we're moving towards, where you don't actually have to change your integration, but you benefit from new data coming on the platform because you built your integration in a particular way. And so we're going through that right now, and that'll never be gone. That'll always be that'll always be a cost that middleware software, whether you're Stripe, whether you're Plaid, whether you're Patch, will have to pay, because that's a bunch of the value you create. And so, we as an organization have to, go through the schlep, if you will, of managing that back-end integration work, because that's why buyers are working with us, or one of the reasons buyers are working with us, is so that they don't have to do that maintenance work.
Right. That's a major piece to that. How do you then define that conversation? Because basically you're making a bunch of decisions for a bunch of customers that don't even know that decisions were even able to be made, right? Like in the way you structure your data object that you're going to be curating for them, right? Do you have a process? I mean, do you just call up a bunch of customers, and be like, hey, we're thinking of doing this. What would it look like if we did for you? Would it help? I mean, what's it like?
You're getting into the product development process now, and we talk to customers every day. I'm on customer calls every day, both on the sell side and on the buy side. Our product managers or engineers are always chatting with customers. And I mean, early results is that the level of unprecedented amount of structured data we're providing to people today already vastly exceeds what's out there, that a lot of folks aren't asking for it necessarily in a different shape, because they're just really, really happy to have it at all. Now, as we mature and as the ecosystem matures and as expectations rise, that discussion or that kind of problem or dynamic you're surfacing will eventually crop up, which is, I'd rather see this information in a specific format or not. That's why customer research is so important. But to date, a lot of folks have been really, really excited just by the fact that something exists at all, because it's a massive step function change from where we were even just 2 years ago.
Do you then on the business end of it, I presume you're taking probably some kind of transaction on the transactions fees, but do you play around with custom solutions as well, or it just depends on, who is asking for the customization and to what extent that customization could then be leveraged for others, right? Do you play around in both realms, or just stay focused on one side of this?
And it's a great question. So there's actually almost two questions in there, which is like, how do you make money? How do you commercialize? And the second is like, what's your philosophy to product development? Which is
Right.
kind of what that custom piece is getting at.
You said
So
it
how do we
much better than I
commercialize?
did.
Appreciate it. Well, I have a habit of when I hear something, how do I share it back to make sure I'm going to go on the right path. So for the commercialization piece, you make money in two ways. The first is a take rate. So essentially a percent fee on the price or value spent on carbon. And the second is platform fees, which kind of look like, depending on if you're using more sophisticated products and features on the platform, as well as you're putting in maybe an abnormally high load on the platform. So are you making hundreds of API calls a day or tens of thousands of API calls a day? Those pricing structures are going to look a little bit different, but those are the two ways we commercialize. The way we develop product is we have this kind of philosophy of we're never going to let customers dictate what our North Star is. We have a very clear vision of what we think the future of environmental markets needs to look like, but we're going to be highly receptive to customers dictating the path we take to get there. And so it's really important to have a very clear and concise world of what does like the future look like at the infinite horizon, if you will, right? What does it look like in 5-10 years, and what kind of shapes, building blocks are going to be present? But the hard part is really actually figure out what's in the in between, right? So it's really easy to actually come up with that simple, beautiful abstraction in the future. What's way harder is, well, how do you take this really messy world we're in now and take a path? And so that's really where customers are really helpful, because at the end of the day, especially if you're a startup, one of the things you're most beholden to is the time of external parties. So people who are prepared to pay for your service, as well as people who are prepared to give you time and feedback on maybe future products and services you might be thinking. And so we typically lean on those organizations to actually direct us a little bit more in the short term, while never really letting them derail where we're heading in the long term. So if they talk about something that's fundamentally incompatible with that feature we're describing, that won't ever get put on the roadmap. But if they're describing something that we weren't anticipating doing this early, but they have a huge amount of excitement around, then we're prepared to accelerate as long as it fits in that kind of longer term puzzle.
Right. How do you, and then, yeah, that's the biggest challenge of software development in general, right? It's like you have a set of features you envision, but it's your customers are going to be paying to use it. So it's got to be customer focused. However, each one individual customer doesn't quite have the priority here, nor should they, because if you're looking to scale this as a real solution that's going to have a real impact for climate, to really kind of accelerate this exchange, this kind of marketplace, you have to have a bigger picture in mind as to where the main was. And that might mean some painful moments where you're like, you had a great early customer and then you made a bunch of changes because it's going to be better for the future, but it doesn't quite align with what they wanted or needed or something. Do you have a strategy on like managing expectations with these customers? Or you guys just sort of put out some of your principles over time online, or just come on shows like this? Like, how do you do it?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thankfully, we actually haven't really had that problem, because typically when people ask us, well, why did you change this thing? I liked it how it was before. We typically will sit down with them and say, well, I understand why you liked it before, and this is how we're going to be addressing that particular problem in the future. And this is also what that broader future looks like, right? And so, at the end of the day, people just want to be able to pay to have their particular problem or need resolved in B2B software. At the end of the day, like that's what they're doing. They have their job, they have their objectives. In many cases, we're working with people whose objectives are to make that business operate more sustainably. But any B2B software, everyone's just trying to accomplish an objective more effectively. And so if you can really walk people through, well, why is the new solution, especially as it fits into that broader mosaic, that broader future that we're describing, more effective than what we had today? We actually haven't had anyone churn because we've shipped more features or shipped different or kind of modified existing features, actually. So that's really at the highest level. It's really just at the end of the day, it's kind of walking through. I know you kind of saw this change without context. This is the broader context and why you should be excited about it.
Okay. I mean, yeah, but we're early stage software development. world, right? So eventually, maybe, who knows, there might be some changes that aren't going to suit everybody because you can't make everybody happy. You can just do the best you can for the greatest customer base and keep moving the platform in this sort of, focused vision for you guys. Can you tell me a little bit about like the Series B experience? Like what was the platform like beforehand? What attracted the investors to then just jump on board? What was sort of the key cornerstone moments around that? And give us a sense of that world, and then paint us the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So for context, we raised a couple rounds in the history of Patch. We were founded in April 2020. Raised a pre-seed right out the gates. Raised a $4.5 million seed round led by Andreessen Horowitz in September of 2020.
Oh, okay.
Series A from Code2 in September of 2021.
Have you
and
been on their podcast? Sorry to
series.
interrupt. Just curious if you've been on on their A16Z podcast.
I think it's actually booked, but I haven't been on it yet.
You haven't been,
I haven't been on it yet.
All right.
Yeah, it's been booked though.
Okay. All right. Congrats. Okay. Sorry.
And then
we
raised this B. No problem. And then we raised this B back in June. And really our kind of general mantra with fundraising in general is it really been, well, what are the like 3 or 4 things you really want to prove out between rounds? And what kind of catalyzed this, and basically once we prove those things out, then we feel, okay, raising more capital to continue to accelerate the journey. And so we weren't anticipating fundraising for our Series B and probably until like April of 2023, or maybe Q1, Q2 of 2023. So we basically did this a year in advance. And the reason was actually just the speed at which we were moving at, the velocity at which we were moving at. And we were actually proved out our Series A goals in a much shorter amount of time than we initially anticipated. And so when our insiders actually saw that, they were the ones who catalyzed the round. They said, hey, it seems like we've kind of hit our goals. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't continue to accelerate there. We kind of had a good discussion and agreed with that take. And then we began the process of looking outside and speaking with a few other folks to understand, should we continue to double down with our insiders or actually bring someone new to the table? And we actually did a hybrid of both, where Energize did the bulk of the round, but our insider and Code2 did a very meaningful portion, much larger than their kind of contractually obligated or mandated pro rata. And so
really? Okay.
It was really all about kind of insider excitement and then catalyzing, well, who else should we actually have along for this ride? Should we keep the circle small, or should we have a slightly bigger tent that'll set us up for success down the road?
Wow, that does dovetail into like VC money and investments in this sort of renewable space over time. Like there's been some ups and downs already in the past. There was one peak and then it backed down, but this seems like lately it's been renewing like a new effort. There's been more cash. And so I bet there's been excitement just to be like, oh wait, they got customers, it's actually working. Yeah, take money. Because there's people they know that this is a big problem, and they know that companies that are addressing it are going to do well in the future. And they're just trying to find who can they quickly capitalize with their capital, right? What's the scope? What's the size of the Series B? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a $55 million round. The goal is to help us grow primarily into Europe while kind of beginning to dip our toes into APAC. And the kind of other element is really, how do we move up market, right? So historically, we've sold to growth stage tech and small enterprise, and now we're going to begin moving up market to sell to larger enterprises as well.
Is this kind of money before?
I have not.
You seem very like calm, like, oh yeah, we just got $55 million to like take it to the next level.
It's funny you say that, because we actually got very similar feedback from some folks who work at Patch, actually, where Aaron is my co-founder. We have this tendency to not really celebrate wins, actually, very often. We have this tendency of like, when something happens, it's like, great, act like we've been there before and keep chugging along. Because really, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter like how many tens of millions of dollars we raise. If we're not able to kind of achieve this scale of climate impact we set out to have, like who cares? And so for us, there's kind of this like relentless focus on like, what's that North Star? What's the goal? which I think is good in some cases because it helps you drive a huge amount of focus and a huge amount of progress in a very short amount of time. But also, one could argue it's not the most healthy thing to like not acknowledge any of the wins along the way. And so trying to find a balance is good. Unfortunately, Aaron and I, although we do keep each other in balance in a lot of different ways, that is not one where we have a yin and a yang, if you will. So we typically got to look to the folks internally to keep us honest on that one.
I know you're probably your day-to-day is like razor sharp focus on just addressing the challenges and the problems and whatever it is that you have to do to keep software like this running, right? But you should also feel some sense of accomplishment that it's real, that people do understand where you're going with this. It's not just a crazy idea between two co-founders to pull this together. It's like, it is happening because it is necessary. And I think, maybe your reaction is perfectly fine, man. I don't know. I would definitely be going, what is going on? What is happening? Because that is a substantial amount. That's a lot of developers you can pull into your team. And then, that's going to take on setting the systems right for bringing HR people, organizing, figuring out what the priorities are, and making sure that everything's still aligning. Are your new goals for the Series B more intimidating or just the same, or just just sort of hitting a conservative mark that you think you can achieve? Like, what's your feeling around those things?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wouldn't say anything Patch is setting out to do is in the realm of conservative, certainly. I mean, it's really at the end of the day, like similar shaped goals, but adding a 0 or 2 in a lot of cases on the magnitude of those goals. And so, kind of when you be going in like Series B to Series C is typically when you go from purely potential to like, this is just a humming business. And so like there's going to actually be a lot more focus on financial efficiency, although like historically Patch has been incredibly efficient, but there's going to be a little bit more quantification of that, as well as understanding, can you grow into new markets, launch new products, and maintain the velocity you had per person when you're a 20-person organization as maybe an 80 or 100-person organization. So it's really like easy to have everyone be efficient when you're a small team. It's much, much harder to scale that. A really big piece, right? Can we continue to ship product? Can we continue to land massive customers at a really high rate? Can we continue to expand geographically and react to this incredibly dynamic ecosystem within we operate? That's what's gotten Patch so far to date. The real question is, can you do that when you make the team twice as big and you're working on 2 times or 3 times as many opportunities and launching as many more products as well? That's going to be the big key.
Yeah. So are you hiring in Europe? Are you hiring whoever you can find the best talent? What's your hiring strategy around this now that this has happened?
So we have headquarters in both San Francisco and London. So San Francisco is the North American office, and London is the European office. We've never let geography get in the way of hiring great people. We have actually a very asynchronous first workflow culture at the company. That being said, we do have maybe a bias for people who are co-located, not necessarily because we want people in the office, but it's actually really easy to get together on a recurring basis, right? So I don't want to operate in a world, especially as a climate company, where we have to fly people in for co-working sessions, right? It's not sure. It's kind of antithetical to being a climate business. That being said, there are phenomenal engineers, designers, or really makers that are in remote areas. It makes sense to have them hired locally because they're not going to be traveling that much.
Where can you tell us a little bit of what have been the watershed moments for you guys along this journey? I mean, I know it's all pretty recent, and like just asking you to reflect on it seems probably, I don't know. So I get the feeling that it's like you're just focused on the next task, the next thing. But what have been the main watershed moments across how'd you get here? How'd you get into this business?
What's really interesting is huge amount of I think romanticism around founding companies, where even from the idea where someone like had an epiphany or a vision or whatever it might be, to like very pivotal moments that take place within the history of the company. I actually don't really subscribe to that model. Like the way we came up with the idea of Patch was very like first principles driven. So like, what are the like five, six, seven things that need to be true in order for us to hit a net zero future. A company like Patch Existing was one of them. Okay, that's what we're going to do. And then over the last 2.5 years, it was really just applying constant pressure on the problems that we thought were the most important. And that resulted in the first year being a huge slugfest. Getting capitalized by A16Z definitely put some wind in our sails for sure. And I'm really fortunate to be able to work with Jeff Jordan along the way, who's on the board of Airbnb and Instacart and all these other great companies. So having him in our corner has obviously been fantastic. But we really signed and transacted our very first customer March of 2021, which is very recent, right? It's only 15, 16 months ago. And so ever since then, it's really just been a constant pressure being applied, and we're actually just really seeing the compounding effect of just focus over 12, 18 months. And so it's something I really like telling folks at Patch is at the end of the day, if anyone at Patch actually just focuses on one problem, on a single problem for 2, 4, 6 weeks, you've almost always come out the other side with actually a fantastic solution. And the reason things have gotten bogged down has always been because we spread ourselves too thin. Mm-hmm. And so for me, there hasn't actually been a distinct watershed moment. It's actually just been the result of 60 people focusing really, really hard and having that compound over 18 months. And you see what's possible, which is what's really, really exciting. So that's why I tend to be a very much on the optimist end of the spectrum when it comes to climate change, because I've seen firsthand what happens when just 60 people just focus on something. Now, Patch is not solving climate change yet by any means, but I think we do have the potential of putting a meaningful dent in it. And if you have 100,000 or 1 million people have the same level of focus that the 60 people at Patch have had, I have no doubt in my mind that we can achieve the kind of scale we need to in order to address climate change.
Yeah, I commend that thinking. I think that's exactly what business is. I mean, every business is at a different stage of their lives, but just chipping away at the problems, sometimes getting close to the problem at hand is what all these opportunities provide you to get the opportunity to work on it and grind out little at a time every day, just hitting it. And then eventually, boom, you have something that's of significant value and of worth being proud and reflecting upon in whatever way you want to do it, right? Whatever celebration. So I commend you for that, man. Obviously the Series B, obviously your institution or your co-founders and the people that are working for you are all validating this and the customers that you're acquiring. But has there been anything that has surprised you beyond your expectations in this whole process that you could speak to?
I think the biggest surprise, we've talked about a lot of things that Patch has done well, but I also think Patch has benefited immensely just from timing, actually. So if we had started this company even like 2 years earlier, I actually don't think we would have had the success that we would have had.
I'm glad you say that. Yeah.
And so I'm actually really surprised at how well we timed this. Like, I honestly feel like I work hard.
You can't time it.
Really hard.
Maybe you just got lucky in the timing, but it's like, but you're at the right. You're at the right time for this.
That's exactly it.
It's the right time. It's the right time. Yeah. 2-3 years, you probably, I don't know. Right. People may not have been as receptive as the problem has increased. So I can only imagine what it's going to be like 2-3 years from now for you guys. Because then they'll be like, oh, the problem's getting, the collective problem I'm talking about. I don't like to mention too much because I don't like a doom and gloom show, but that problem is bringing pressure on everybody to do something. And you're now positioned with this beautiful product API. You're one of those players in there. So congratulations, man. Thank you for your time. We blew through an hour here. I feel like we do this again. I want to have you guys back. Please, let's do this again. I want to dig a little deeper. Maybe we could show a couple screenshots or something, or walk us through kind of a customer story. If there's a customer out there who wants to share what it's been like using the platform. But yeah, man, this is awesome. Brennan, really nice to meet you. Best of luck to you and your co-founder. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to find out more, it's patch.io. Just go check it out. Are you still in beta? Like, do you need to request access? Like, what if you just somebody wants to explore the current platform? Can you do that? Or where are you at?
If you go to patch.io, you can kind of put in your email and information and what you're trying to build with Patch, and someone will be in contact within 24 hours.
Okay. maybe we can get a demo and start looking at it. Okay.
That's it.
All right, cool. Thank you, everybody. Thanks again. I really appreciate, especially the latest round of new subscribers. I hope you guys like this kind of stuff because this is what I'm going to do. So take care, everybody. Bye.
Visit throughthenoise.us for more episodes and subscribe to our newsletter. This show is produced by Through the Noise Consulting, uniting external communications and internal IT functions to ensure data and privacy are protected while creating innovative communications platforms. Want to start your own podcast? We can help. Visit getthroughthenoise.com to learn more.